Okay, so I wasn't saying that. All I was saying was, oh, wait, just a second. If I were a rich man, boom, you would say I'm bad because I'm rich. That's because you are a little. If you follow the blind, you'll go in a ditch. If you aren't a thinking man. Yeah, well, don't call us. We'll call you. Hello. Good afternoon, planet Earth. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, whatever it is, where you are. Here, it's in the high 40s, middle 30s, and bottom 20s. Partly cloudy with some breaking through tomorrow, a little precipitation. And anyway, hello. Hello, my name is Jeremiah Gunn. You killed my country. Prepare to die. DEI and Democrat Party. The People's Party. Anyway, this is Jeremiah Gunn Show. Hello, hello. This is the Jeremiah Gunn Show. Thank you so much for joining us here. And when I say us, it's always we the people, U.S., United States of America. This is your undocumented expert, Professor No, K-N-O-W. This show is dedicated to Charlie Kirk. It's the Jeremiah Gunn Show. Always dedicated to Charlie Kirk, always will be. So I've been told a few times that I should teach history. That would happen. We'd just be into discussion at lunch or something, and they'd say, you really got to get out of here. And, you really should be teaching history. Well, and I'd always say, I'm not dead yet. So that's kind of my passion. And I want to begin with a couple of, this is at least part two of what I call the magical, tragical history tour of us, the United States. I'd like to start off with a couple of quotes. And remember our motto here. Memory is the soul of a race. Insanity is the loss of memory. Most people, when they think of history, they think of those that forget the past or doomed to repeat it. Santa Anna said that, I believe. To be ignorant of what happened before you were born is to remain a child. That's what Cicero said. See if I can, oops, there we go. See if that's any better. Okay. So there's another quote. Sometimes quotes come in threes. This is from Frank Herbert's Dune series, and he has one character say to the other, "When I'm weaker than you, I ask for freedom because that is according to your principles. When I'm stronger than you, I take away your freedom because that's according to my principles." That could be the motto or the mission statement, so I used to call it in the corporate world. That could be the mission statement of the sinners who are destroying our country and our world. Sin is an acronym, CIN. It's not that network. This is, by the way, CSN, the Common Sense Network, part of the ISI broadcasting system. Behind enemy lines, broadcasting from the Confederate States of America, just as in 1860, same enemy. Keeping the plantation going, keeping slavery alive. The only thing is now they want everybody in the world to be a slave. They're bringing them in. They're flying them in as long as they can stay in power. No principles, no peace. We're going to talk about the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So let's go over that quote again. When I am weaker than you, I ask for freedom because that is according to your principles. But when I'm stronger than you, I take away your freedom because that's according to my principles. And please put that in the memory. Hold on to that because it's going to become important here later. It's going to come along back. So we left off. This is the magical, tragical history tour of us. This is part two. We left off on the fact that the people that founded this country, those that won our liberty, believed the source of happiness to be liberty and the source of liberty to be courage. Bingo. And so they had a problem with what's called the Catholic kings. It was formational in their first charter, the Mayflower Compact, which was kind of built when we built our rights as citizens here in this country, as subjects of the king.
We kind of built those rights on the Magna Carta and so forth. And so they had a real problem. So when we built things like our secular Ten Commandments, which is the Bill of Rights. Remember, no Bill of Rights, no Constitution. No Constitution, no America. It's that simple. That's why when the Democrats tried to destroy it in 1860 and earlier, and they're still trying to destroy it today, you can't. You can't separate our foundational corporate bylaws. And in those, they had safeguards against things like religious oppression. And who were they oppressed by? Well, the founding fathers, their founding fathers, the Puritans and the Pilgrims, they were asylum-seeking refugees who immigrated here to have freedom of religion, not freedom from religion, freedom of religion. We would not be here if it weren't for them. But they had a little problem with the Catholic kings, and you'll hear more about that kind of as we go along, or maybe on other shows. I'm not here to knock Catholics. It's just we have to understand where we came from. Otherwise, that it was a different structure when you had one world religion, one world, one state, and church and state combined into this oppressive thing that made people flee because they were killing them. They were killing and they were making martyrs out of them. People who just wanted to practice their freedom of conscience and religion. I don't know how many atheists there were around then wanting to die for their cause, which is that there is nothing up there. But I hope it'll come along in here somewhere. Yeah, I think it will. So let's just talk about it. So what did they do? They built a system of tolerance, not a situation where atheists and agnostics and cultists. By the way, I think I just forgot to explain what a sinner is. It's a sinner. All who sin are slaves. The sin is an acronym, CIN, and it's communist, Islamist, and Nazi. And communism and socialism are the same thing. You don't have to get that S in there. If you're a C, you're an S. If you're an S, you're a C. It doesn't matter. Ayn Rand pointed out that the only difference is one is death by murder and one is death by suicide. So it doesn't really matter to the person who's dead or behind bars or an iron curtain. So anyway, so what had happened is they when you go to Monticello, you find the author of the Declaration of Independence is buried there in his home, but he was not as proud of like being president, like the Louisiana Purchase. I don't even think the Declaration of Independence, quote unquote author, he was the lead of a committee of 5. Author of the Declaration of Independence. I don't think he was even that proud of that as he was when he was the governor of Virginia, or the House of Burgesses legislature that they had in Virginia. He authored the Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty or something. And it was basically built on tolerance. He said that it matters not if my neighbor believes there are no gods or 20. It neither breaks my leg nor picks my pocket. But, however, he said religious monopoly and religious oppression are never far apart. So he's actually, I think he's the one who wrote this famous phrase that we throw around as if it's in the Constitution of separation of church and state. But as typical in the irony age, he was trying to assure a group called the Danbury Baptists that we are not going to have one government religion like they had in Europe, like they still have in Europe. Like they had when Dietrich Bonhoeffer had to die at Auschwitz after being tortured because the government controlled the religion. You see where we're going here? So he said, it matters not to me whether my neighbor believes there are no gods or 20. It neither breaks my leg or picks my pocket. Now, there weren't very many people in the colonies that believed there are no God or 20. There are now. There's a lot. So the idea, again, what's it called in L.A.? In D.C., it's called the Holocaust Museum. What is it called in L.A.? The Museum of Tolerance. So we're not we were set up that we would tolerate anybody, as he just said. But we weren't set up that some small percentage of Sam Harris and Dawkins and Hawkins or whatever can tell us that we're idiots and we have to live under their rule. They'll if we're real nice and we be good, they'll let us be here. That's not how it works. There's this concept called the cut flowers theory, where these people, these atheists, these guys who form an organization that believes in that there's nothing. And so, I don't know, they have a meeting every week and they write books that we're going to talk about the fact that there isn't anything, that there's nothing out there, that nothing exists. And we'll make the world a better place. Ben Franklin, I think he knew. He fled kind of Boston because it was too uptight religiously, and he went to Pennsylvania, which was a open area. And he wanted to have a little bit of religious tolerance. So, but he said if he said if how if people how did he put it? It's so good. I probably should have written it down, but he said if men are this wicked with religion, how would they be without it? Well, we're finding out. This has been labeled in the last several years the post-Christian era or the neo-pagan era. So people say, I don't want the religious right, but they're okay with the pagan wrong. That's him how okay. And they'll let us know if it's okay that we can exercise the First Amendment. Think about the First Amendment. How does it go? What's number one? Number 111. 1.1. What's number one is freedom of religion. And then I don't even remember the rest, but it's assembly, peaceful assembly, speech, and the press. It isn't the other way around. It isn't backwards. It's not. So anyway, he said, it matters not if my neighbor believes there are no gods or 20, neither breaks my leg nor picks my pocket. But he also said religious monopoly and religious oppression are never far apart. He knew that we did not want to have. So when he talked about separation of church and state, he was trying to assure these Baptists who were persecuted in Europe for their belief, their denomination. That's a horrible story. Read about it sometime. And persecuted by the church, which was married to the state politically. And so, he told them, don't worry, we're not going to have that. We're not going to have that here. But when I met the guy playing him for 20 years at Colonial Williamsburg, and actually on the video in the Jefferson Memorial, he gets asked by the crowd at these press conferences, are you an atheist? And he's like, no, I'm a vestryman. I'm a vestryman of the church. He had his own. That sounded like an elder. No, there's no question. He referred to Christianity a lot. Again, I'll say it again. Even Bill Maher, that gargoyle, he said that he told Charlie Kirk that the founders were a lot more Christy than I was ever led to believe. After he wrote his books condemning religion and so forth. Raised as a Catholic, by the way. He was talking to the guy that came from Parks and Rec and Guardians of the Galaxy. I think his name's Chris Pratt. He was talking about how he still gets this funny feeling when he goes into a Catholic church because he kind of knows that it means something and it's right, but they were so hard on him that he can't really accept it. Unfortunately, this is going to be tough to hear, but my sister, I love Catholic people, but my sister said one time, we were all raised, because she said, once a Catholic, always something else. I've had Jehovah's Watchtower Witness come to my door, Mormons come to my door and say they were raised Catholic, but now they found the better way, It's too bad. It's too bad. You don't want to get turned off by something, but I think that's the enemy's plan. I think that's it. So tolerance is not equal to takeover. When the secular pagan anti-God nuns, that's the biggest religion in recent years. Maybe Charlie Kirk put a dent in that, but it was nuns. I'm a nun, N-O-N-E. I'm no religion. But when they decide and they debate whether to tolerate us, the no king but Jesus ones, that's what That's what John Adams said, no king but Jesus. William Penn, the guy that Pennsylvania is named after, he said, men will either be governed by God or ruled by tyrants. John Adams, he said the Constitution is made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the governing of any other. And then he said, if I heard that any man or woman or child did not believe there was a heaven or hell, I would recommend that they take opium. Why not? Why not? Why not? Canada has this new thing called MAID. Basically, it's assisted suicide. And people are taking advantage of it. It's part of the Affordable Care Act up there. Denmark was doing that for a long time. You're a little bit down, a little blue, come on in and we'll take care of you. No matter your age or condition. So, you know, in the Revolution, Washington knew that his troops were going to go fighting against the Canadians, and there were a lot of French, a lot of Catholics up there. And he basically urged that they have some beautiful quotes. You got to be tolerant of these people. You got to don't look down on them because they don't have the same religious beliefs as you. You have to fight them, but don't think less of them. And he urged them to not be unkind to these different beliefs. He was a great supporter of Jews. There's a synagogue temple, like the first one in the country, that's dedicated, and he dedicated it, and he wrote this beautiful letter. You can look it up. It hasn't been taken down yet, but you can find it. This is beautiful. And there was a hero named Haim Solomon. He was a Jew from, he might have been Ashkenazi, but he came from Poland. He was a financier. You know, a lot of Jews were into finance, and they get beat up for that. But that's the only thing they were allowed to do in Europe. It was so oppressive. So, yeah, I want to tell a couple of anecdotes that have to do with this. When I'm weaker than you, I ask for freedom because that's according to your principles. When I'm stronger than you, I take away your freedom because that's according to my principles. This is what the separation of church and state was intended to solve. That's the whole point of it. That was the whole point. So, in the irony age, they're saying, oh, separation of church and state. But you know what? They're stepping right past. Remember the WTF, window, table, floor. If a problem can be stated as a picture of a PowerPoint that shows a window, table, floor. So the people will say, oh, separation of church and state. And then the religious people in the country will say, oh, can we pretty please have a little bit? Or do we just have to render to Caesar? I mean, but the reality of it is that separation of church and state was written to assure religious believers that they would always have freedom of religion, not freedom from it. That's what, get out the Constitution, Google it, read that first thing. Congress shall pass no law establishing any particular state-owned religion, or prohibit the free exercise thereof. So it's caused a little problem for SCOTUS and so forth when they get into, you got some devil worshiper or a child sacrifice or, I don't know, Sharia law, where they want to have honor killings and multiple wives, bigamy and things like that. So when I'm weaker than you, I ask for freedom because that is according to your principles. When I'm stronger than you, I take away your freedom because that's according to my principles. So I was talking to a guy at work. He's a financial guy. I think he was a controller. And we were just talking one day at lunch. We played basketball together. And he was Catholic, pretty staunch Catholic. And he said to me, you were a Catholic? And I said, yeah, born and raised. And he said, what happened? I said, because he knew I was a Christian, just fundamental, just non-denominational, period, simple Christian. And he said, what happened? And I said, I read the Bible. And he said, ooh, ouch. Oh, well, he says, you're right. And I'm always telling my family, it isn't just go there and do the rituals and think you got to believe this stuff or you don't. And we had a mutual friend who was Mormon. And I told him about, this kind of quote. I said, you know what? Mormons are a small percent, although they've grown pretty fast, They were invented in around 1830-ish. And they weren't around in the when they were creating the Constitution and all these laws of tolerance. So I don't know what they kind of would have done with them. But I said, when they're X percent, a small number, they don't try to tell us how to live. But if we were a small percent, those who weren't Mormons and they were in charge of everything, it'd be a different story. It would be a different story. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights. That's kind of where we're up to historically. The First and Second Amendment had to do with the Catholic kings and their war on the middle class. This is what statists, and remember, church and state, they were the same with the Roman Catholic Church, which became the Henry VIII's Anglican Church, whatever. They were in charge. And in Europe, certain areas of Europe, Luther was under the protection of some duke, and then when the Catholic Church was trying to kill him, and if he weren't under the protection of this dukedom, so he wouldn't be here. Never would have been a Reformation, not one led by him. Well, he was protected by this guy, so they couldn't come get him and execute him and torture him and everything else like they wanted to, because of his sin of wanting people to have the Bible in their language instead of Latin and not through a priest. And what was that thing's called? As the coin in the coffer rings, another soul from purgatory springs. Indulgences. So that's what happened. That's what happened with him. Well, so what happened with Germany said, all right, enough. The Holy Roman Empire versus Germany, etc. They said everybody in this district will be Lutheran, and everybody over here will be Catholic. So just like kind of like living in one of the blue states. You're a Democrat. Well, no, I'm not. Well, it don't matter. You're going to do whatever we say, because democracy means that some small percent takes over via the big cities. You don't get to have your rights. Equal protection under the law, the Constitution. So, let's have an example. Where did this Catholic king's war on the middle class come into play? Second Amendment. What does it say? Scalia, before he died, he wrote a book called Reading Law, and he gave a little interview on Uncommon Knowledge. It was just brilliant. He said, look, it doesn't say, it would be nice if you could have a gun if you wanted and filled out all the paperwork to go hunting with or to protect your family and your home. It talks about it as if it's a right that they believed they already had. It says the right, that's how it opens, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Period. End of sentence. Infringed means flocked with. You can't F it up. You can't flock it up. It doesn't matter. You can't do that just because you feel like it. That's the whole problem with our country. So where did that come from? Because the Catholic kings were saying, hey, look, if these middle class people, they had firearms, if they get enough weapons, we won't be able to control them. And so they made sure they put that in. They didn't say it would be nice if we had this right. They said the right shall not be infringed. And so this is why they had some problems with, the church and state Catholics. We talked about Germany saying if you live in this area, well, they had this big meeting. If you live in this area, you're Lutheran. If you live in this area, you'll be Catholic. They thought they could do it geographically. It's kind of like the way PBS thinks about the Civil War and everything. So they had this big meeting, and they said, all right, here's the decision. If you live in this area, you'll be Protestant. If you live in that area, you'll be Catholic. Notice they're leaving out everybody else. There was other evangelical free, and there were other free thinkers that wanted to have freedom of religion, and nope, it's run by the state. People would tell their dad, hey, I'm not going to be a lawyer. I'm going to be a vicar. I'm going to be a priest. I'm going to be a cleric. And their dad would say, oh, yeah, that's a good job, government job. Even down to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. the government owned the church. So they had this big meeting, and they said, if you live in this area, you're going to be Protestant. I mean, you're going to be Lutheran, and if you live in this area, you're going to be Catholic. And so a group of people that stood up and walked out, they were called Protestants because they protest the idea of that. So a lot of people think that Lutherans are Protestant. Anybody who's not a Catholic is Protestant, but that's not really where that word came from. It's kind of like the word less than right. How did that enter our language? It's interesting to talk about. So, how did this country get split up into the North and South the way it did? And remember, it was early that the Democrats walked out. They walked out of the Declaration of Independence Congress and the regular. They walked out, led by South Carolina. It's always South Carolina. They walked out. Why? Because it was philosophy, not geography. The South was just kind of, I don't know whether it was just sort of natural because it was more agrarian in the South or because they kind of moved it that way. But it was sort of an aristocracy in the South. It was an aristocracy, big plantations and in the North, it was more cities and factories and mechanics and merchants and more of the middle class, maybe a lawyer, maybe a physician, but just kind of working class people that rose up. I think Bismarck called England a nation of shopkeepers. I think Hitler called them that. Well, Margaret Thatcher was a shopkeeper's daughter. So you have these sort of, I'd call them blue collar, white collar workers, and then you have these aristocrats who are used to having man servants and women servants and mules and asses and everything. One of the wives of one of these folks in the Civil War, was it was the first war fought by literate soldiers, so there's a lot of writing about it. She would say, she called the men of the South, she said they think they're biblical patriarchs. They got their concubines and their mules and their asses and their cattle and their servants, man servants and female servants and slaves, and they got all that stuff. Yeah, they had the concubines, and the women kind of resented that, but that's kind of the way it was. So when there came time to be a break in their mind, they were like, we're fighting for a way of life. They still talk about it. They called it the lost cause when the Republicans defeated their slavery. They called it the lost cause, and they wept and yearned for it again. The South will rise again, It was a way of life, two ways of life. They didn't like the cities, Jefferson, and he was right. He was right. The cities and everybody having a equal say and all that stuff, that wasn't an aristocracy hierarchy that they were familiar with, even though they were good men, at least the founders for sure. So the Democrats walked out of that one, and it just kind of kept going. So now kind of what happened when we were an early country, we had a thing called the Quasi-War and the XYZ affair. And what it was there's a book called Our Oldest Enemy. It's about France. And the Quasi-War, all the way down, France has been our enemy. Lafayette helped. Yeah, Lafayette helped. He was unique. He didn't do it with the full backing of either the royalty or the Jacobins who destroyed that country with their French Revolution, with the polar opposite of ours. So that what happened is there was this real divide. Watch the HBO series John Adams if you're interested. It's marvelous. It's excellent. But there was this real divide because Jefferson was a Francophile. He loved calling each other citizen, and he called this a republic. He was a Republican Democrat. But he loved the idea that, he said, a little revolution now and then is a good thing, and the tree of liberty is watered by the blood of patriots and tyrants, okay? But they had his faction led by the French, and that's why they came up with the Alien and Sedition Act, because they were marching through the streets with miniature guillotines, celebrating the revolution over there, which was not ours. Edmund Burke wrote about it. I think Adam Smith too, but it was really evil, very, very evil. And so, I say all the way to John Kerry because he was a Francophile like Jefferson. Jefferson he had a couple flaws. He was magnificent, awesome, but he was only 32, 3, Charlie Kirk's age. But, very wise man. But he had a couple of, what do they call that, lacuna. He had some myopic blind spots, and one was about his trust of human nature. Alexander Hamilton had to say to him, "Your people, sir, are a great beast. You don't understand what mob violence is." A wonderful book called Demonic. And there was a physician during the French Revolution who just wrote about what happens to a mob, the psychology of it. And you know what? Showed it to my dad, who was a World War II generation. I let him listen to it, or got it for him to listen to, and or my sister did. Anyway, he just said, "I can't refute that. Read it. It's brilliant." Something happens to a mob. The Bolsheviks that executed the royal family instead of just letting them go to England or something. There's something very sick about this mob violence that happens. And so, and John Kerry, to bring it up to date, he goes over to Davos in his private jet because he's so worried about the environment. They parks next to all their private jets. And he says, we got a problem in America, the First Amendment, First and Second Amendment. We can't get anything done because of these. These are a problem. He's telling Europe that. It's like Tampon Tim telling Spain that the guy in the White House is an orange clown and stand against him right in the middle of a war. This guy who's so rampant corrupt with fraud, he's just presiding over a nightmare. Maybe the worst governor in history, in all of history. And he's going over there doing that. That's not treason? Anyway. John Kerry ran for president. He don't like the First and Second Amendment too much. He was really into France. He spoke French because they see themselves as these erudite, aristocrats that don't need these little people unless they can get them to vote for them. So then we had the War of 1812 because the British were just taking our sailors off of ships and putting them in their navy. It was called impressment. That was the main reason. There were some border disputes with Canada and so forth. But, interesting thing about Canada was called New France. I think it's kind of interesting, but it was also called Acadia, which is sometimes applied to, I think, a national park in Maine and stuff like that. But when they went down to New Orleans, down the Mississippi was discovered, LaSalle and Champlain. Great book called Champlain's Dream. Magnificent. Anyway, well, these Acadians, I think they were kicked out by the British because they were too French and too Catholic. And they kicked them out. They went down to New Orleans, and the Acadians settled down there. And typical American fashion, they screwed up the name and, they're Cajuns. They're Cajuns. They're Acadians. They're Cajuns. So anyway, that's where that came from. They came from French Canada. I met a guy where guys sort of have a hobby of trying to guess where somebody's from. I was talking to this high-level project engineer in this high-tech company and technology company, and I just said to him, do you mind? I just met him. I said, do you mind if I ask you if I guess where you're from or whatever? He said, go ahead. And I thought maybe he's Dutch, and then I thought maybe Belgian or something. Then I thought he's kind of sounded a little bit like Jean-Claude Van Damme as an old guy, old fighter. So, but I said, nah, he's saying duh too much, duh. He said it once or twice. I said, are you French Canadian? And he said, you're exactly right there. No, you're only the second person that ever guessed that, So it's funny. They talk like Cajuns. Cajuns talk like them. That's where they came from. So that's enough of a diversion. But so we had the War of 1812. Very interesting. The Battle of New Orleans, where Andrew Jackson was a hero with this conglomeration of pirates and Spanish and Indians and freed blacks and unfreed blacks, slaves, and all this stuff. And he defeated the heck out of the British. Real soldiers. That was our second revolution, they call it, because they were trying to take us out. in our infancy. They were trying to smother us in the crib, in the cradle. So the weird thing about it was they didn't have cell phones, or they didn't even have telegraph. So it was like 3 weeks or 2 weeks or more after the war was already over. The Treaty of, I think, Ghent or Brussels or something already. But, it takes a while for the mail to come all the way across and let people know, stop shooting. So a lot of British people died in those battles down there, and he became a hero. Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, it's probably time to talk about him right now. The first Democrat, and that's why they're called a donkey, but it really was a jackass, because the people that didn't like him so much, they called him Andrew Jackass. But they said that's kind of cool. A jackass is strong and works hard and has a strong back, and is stubborn. It won't put up with stuff. So that's cool. So he had this. I think the 1820s were called the era of good feelings, and I was telling a guy at work about that, and he rolls his eyes and cringes and throws up and does a few flips because he was taught by the textbooks of the local college of Howard Zinn, the people's history, the communist history, that, yeah, good feelings, sure, yeah. They hate America. That your taxes, in case you didn't know, this was pointed out by William F. Buckley in 1950 and Richard Weaver in 1948, that they're taking your money and they're teaching your children, as you write bigger and bigger checks, to hate America. It's really good. It's called The University of Destruction. The Universities of Destruction. Another great book. So I saw Matt Walsh, I think his name is. He did a thing on the Indian Removal Act, the Trail of Tears, and said it was all BS. CS, sorry, Cowshite, Caca de la Vaca. It's not really true, and he just completely debunks the whole thing. I'm not saying they didn't get their hair mussed. I'm not saying we treated them absolutely perfectly, but they didn't treat us perfectly either. And so, anyway, it's fake news, according to Matt Walsh. Watch that video and see what you think. Don't just listen. Don't let them unscrew your head. Head Start, kindergarten, preschool, all the way to PhD, and just pour in their filth. Yeah, what did Nietzsche say? They vomit their lies and call it a newspaper. It's time to fact check the fact checkers. Anyway, so the 1820s, you had the rise of cults in 1820s, 30s. All of the cults in America came from there. No offense, but Mormonism, Watchtower Witness came later, came at the end of that century, 1890s. Christian Science, all that stuff. That's about when they were invented, and there was also socialism came on the scene. These guys had these socialist utopias, and I'm just going to read the quote, but I'm not going to read it. No, but one of them was called New Harmony in Indiana. And this guy named Owens tried to get this thing going, and it was free love and like a commune, and against everything that the man stood for. Just like in the days of the Mayflower, he found out that it just doesn't work, and his son wrote these beautiful stories about why socialism doesn't work. He would stock the central store houses and put salads in there and everything, and they were going to eat right and live right and share alike and all this stuff, and it basically just attracted people who wanted something for nothing. So his son wrote this beautiful soliloquy about that can't work, but it was tried. Utopia. Remember utopia it's a made up word, and it means everywhere and nowhere. It means it doesn't exist. That's what it means. So, the son named Owens of the New Harmony Utopia explained exactly why it didn't work. And, the Mormons originally settled in, was it Nauvoo, Illinois? And And they had problems, and they were being persecuted and everything. And so they moved out to Utah. Utah was going to be called Desiree. And but then when they wanted to get statehood, the government said, no, well, no, I know separation of church and state is fine, but you can't have polygamy, which was a basic tenet. And racism was a tenet of they believed that the blacks were marked, they were the mark of Cain that's talked about in the Bible. That's what they were. They were this tribe in that made up plagiarized novel that they called Joseph Smith's translation. So, by the way, again, no offense, but if you wanna read one of the greatest writers of, I did my comparative religion term paper on Mormonism. I read everything there is. It could be another show, but one of the guys who wrote the greatest stuff about it was Mark Twain. When he was passing through in the book Roughing It, in his book Roughing It, he was going out to Nevada to work with his brother, who was assistant to the governor, and he got a copy of the Book of Mormon, and he read it, and he just writes the most excellent critique of it that you've ever seen. He wasn't a strong Christian or maybe even a believer, but he did a great job, as he is wont to do. So anyway, they said, well, no, you can't have polygamy and be a state. So they had a revelation, and they no more polygamy, even though it was a basic tenet of their religion. But they wanted to become a state, so there they go. And then you have the history of the Mormon battalion and in this Mexican-American War, and they'll tell you all this stuff about all their contributions they made and so forth. They won't talk about the Mormon Mountain Meadow Massacre. John Voight played, I think, Brigham Young in the movie. It's very sad, very interesting, but very sad. And so that's where they came from. But they had a revelation, I guess. The president of their organization is the prophet, and said, "No, well, I guess no more polygamy then." I guess it somehow magically the word of God or the word from God jived with the law from Washington, D.C. And just like when BYU started to fall too far behind in the standings, they had a revelation that blacks aren't so bad and browns aren't so bad as we thought they were. Sorry. There's there is a book, there's a section of the good book in Judeo-Christian wisdom literature that says, have I become your enemy because I've told you the truth? Can I hope not? Because it says, faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are sweet. You want somebody to tell you the truth, don't you? You don't want somebody to lie to you. I'll never do that. Never do that. So we had a bunch of people leading up to the Civil War. We had a bunch of presidents. Democrats. Did you say Democrats? Even from the North. And even the war with Mexico. It's famous. It's famously said that Henry David Thoreau and no less than Lincoln as a congressman were against it. Do you know why? I had read so much about this that I didn't take me long to figure out why. Why would Lincoln be against that war? Well, because the Democrats wanted to take over Mexico and Central America and South America so they could have more slave states. And the idea of having states be designated slave or free as they came in was what got Lincoln interested in politics. No way. No way. So that's why he didn't like it. But there was all these Democrat presidents that they could see what was happening coming up. Franklin Pierce, Buchanan. Buchanan was right before the Civil War, and Lincoln was kind of champing at the bit to get in. Buchanan was like Biden. He was on his way out, and Lincoln said, my God, he's going to give up the game before I can even take his seat at the poker table. He's going to give it all away. He's going to blow it. Franklin Pierce was from, New Hampshire? Live free or die? He was a radical, foaming at the mouth slavery advocate. Democrat. It's the whole history. That's their whole history. Well, Buchanan is said to possibly be the first homosexual president. He did not have a wife. I think his niece was the sort of mistress of ceremonies for the White House, but he had a roommate kind of friend. And, Andrew Jackson wasn't too fond of him. He called him, even though they were Democrats like him, but he called the two of them Aunt Fancy and Miss Nancy. Anyway, I guess if it doesn't really matter, here's a little principle. If you say, well, Lincoln can't be president because he's a homosexual, like they used to say, you can't turn around and say that was wrong. Okay, let's say that was wrong. That's wrong. It's nobody's business, right? You can't say that, oh, look at how many great men were homosexuals. Da Vinci, Lincoln, Alan Turing, Hey, wait, I thought you said it doesn't matter. If it doesn't disqualify them, you can't count their success towards that category, right? I mean, isn't that fair? This is fair. So we leading up to the Civil War, Democrat Party does nothing about it, and that's where we'll break for this time, and pick it up next time. Thank you for listening so much. All this stuff is so important. You might not think it is, but it really is true that if you don't understand where we're at, if you don't understand that this is a war, that it's existential, both sides are saying it, that it's constitutional crisis, both sides are saying it, we're not going to make it out. Please. Thank you. Thank you for listening.